An old man is walking up a set of stone steps toward a temple, and he is holding something in his arms. We will get to him, but not yet. First, go back further. Go back to a small room, lit by a single oil lamp, where another old man is setting down his pen. His name is Malachi, and the name itself means my messenger. He does not know it yet, but the words he has just finished writing are the last words God will speak through a prophet for 400 years. He rolls the scroll shut, the lamp flickers, and somewhere in the deep machinery of heaven, a door closes. Listen to how it ends. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. A promise, a name, a door left open just a crack, and then nothing. No prophet stands up the next year to add a line. No burning bush, no voice from the whirlwind. No, thus saith the Lord. The generation that heard Malachi grows old and dies. Their children grow old and die. Their grandchildren. For 4 centuries, the God who had spoken to Abraham under the stars, who had thundered on Sinai, who had whispered to Elijah in a cave, that God says nothing at all. We call it the 400 years of silence. The gap between the last page of the Old Testament and the first page of the New. Most Bibles print it as a single blank sheet of paper. You turn from Malachi to Matthew, and your thumb crosses 400 years in half a second. But here is what most people miss. That blank page is the loudest thing in your Bible, because the silence was not empty. Behind that curtain, while heaven said nothing, everything was moving. Empires rose and shattered. A king sacrificed a pig on the altar of God and nearly erased the Jewish faith from the earth. A family of village priests took on the largest army in the world and won. The scriptures were carried into a new language. Roads were paved. A hunger was building in a whole nation, a hunger for someone who had been promised and had not come. So let me tell you what this story really is. This is not a story about an empty stage. This is not a story about a God who packed up and left. This is not a story about silence at all. This is a story about the most important thing God has ever done while appearing to do nothing. Because when you finally understand what happened in those 400 years, the wars, the traitors, the heroes, the language, the roads, the aching, waiting hearts, you will understand something that will change how you read the Christmas story forever. You will understand why the New Testament could not have happened 1 year earlier. And you will understand why, on a night in a small town in Judea, when a young woman finally laid a baby in a feeding trough, all of heaven had been building toward that exact moment for 4 centuries. There is a phrase for it, tucked into one of Paul's letters. He wrote that, when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son. The fullness of time. Not early, not late, full. As if time itself were a cup, and God was watching it fill, drop by drop, war by war, generation by generation, waiting for the precise instant it would spill over. The 400 years were the filling of that cup. And here is the part that should stop you cold. If you have ever prayed and heard nothing back, if you have ever sat in a season where God felt like a closed door, where the heavens were brass, and your questions just echoed, then this is your story too. Because the people living through these 400 years thought God had forgotten them. They were wrong. He had never been more at work. So stay with me. We are going to walk through all 400 years. We will start with a fading empire and a young man on a war horse who will accidentally build the highway the gospel travels down. We will watch a madman defile the temple. We will follow a hammer into battle. We will feel the whole world tilt as Rome marches in. And at the very end, we will come back to that old man on the temple steps, the one holding something in his arms. Because he has been waiting his entire life for what he is holding. And so, in a way, have you. To understand the silence, you have to understand the world Malachi left behind. When he set down his pen, the Jewish people were living under Persia. And by the standards of the ancient world, Persia was a gentle master. The Persians had let the exiles go home from Babylon. They had funded the rebuilding of the temple. A Jew could keep the Sabbath, teach his sons the Torah, and walk to Jerusalem without a Persian soldier stopping him. It was not freedom, but it was tolerable. And then, far to the west, in a rocky kingdom most Judeans had never heard of, a boy was growing up who would swallow the entire world before his 33rd birthday. Here's the strange part. 200 years earlier, the prophet Daniel had seen him coming. In a vision, Daniel watched a goat charge across the earth, so fast its feet never seemed to touch the ground, and the goat had one great horn between its eyes. An angel explained it plainly. The goat is the kingdom of Greece, and the great horn is its first king. Daniel even saw what would happen. When that horn broke, the empire would split into four. He wrote it down centuries before the man was born. The man was Alexander of Macedon. History would call him Alexander the Great. He came out of the north like a weather front. He was barely 20 when he took the throne, and within a decade he had shattered the Persian Empire that had stood for 200 years. Egypt, Syria, Babylon, Persia itself, all the way to the edge of India. He did not just conquer these lands. He conquered them fast, the way a flood conquers a valley. And everywhere the flood went, it left behind the same silt. That silt was Greek, not the polished Greek of Athenian philosophers. A simpler, portable, everyday Greek that soldiers and traders spoke. The Greeks had a word for it. They called it koine, which simply means common Greek, the Greek of the marketplace and the harbor and the barracks. And because Alexander's armies carried it into every city they took, within a generation you could sail from Spain to the borders of India and be understood the entire way in a single language. Hold that thought, because 400 years later, when a fisherman named John and a doctor named Luke and a tent maker named Paul sit down to write about a carpenter from Nazareth, they will not write in Hebrew. They will not write in Latin. They will write in Koine Greek, the common tongue Alexander spilled across the world. The New Testament you own exists in a language a Macedonian teenager on a war horse made universal without ever meaning to. But it gets stranger. There is a story, preserved by the Jewish historian Josephus, about the day Alexander came to Jerusalem. His armies were sweeping down the coast, and the city braced for slaughter. According to Josephus, the high priest went out to meet the conqueror, not with an army, but in his priestly robes, at the head of a procession of priests in white. And Alexander, the man who had leveled cities and burned Persepolis to the ground, is said to have stepped down from his horse and bowed. His stunned generals asked him why. Alexander is said to have answered that before he ever left Macedonia, he had seen this very priest in this very robe in a dream, a figure who promised him victory over Persia. Whether the story happened exactly that way, we cannot prove. But Josephus tells us the result. Alexander spared Jerusalem. He let the Jews keep their laws. He even, the story goes, was shown the book of Daniel and the prophecy of the Greek king who would crush Persia, and understood that the prophecy was about him. Then he moved on, and a few years later, at the age of 32, in a palace in Babylon, Alexander the Great died of a fever with the whole earth in his hands and no heir old enough to hold it. And do you remember what Daniel had seen? That when the great horn broke, the kingdom would split into four. That is exactly what happened. Alexander's generals carved his empire into pieces and went to war over the corpse. Out of the wreckage, four major kingdoms rose. Two of them matter enormously for our story, because the tiny land of Judea sat right on the border between them, like a farmhouse built exactly on a fault line. To the south, in Egypt, rose a dynasty called the Ptolemies. To the north, in Syria, rose a dynasty called the Seleucids. There were two other kingdoms, as well, one back in Macedonia and one in Asia Minor, and together they made the four that Daniel had seen when the great horn broke. But those two never reached down to touch Judea. It is the south and the north, Egypt and Syria, that matter to our story. And little Judea, with its temple and its Torah and its stubborn refusal to worship anyone's gods but its own, was about to be caught between them, crushed back and forth for the better part of a century. But before the crushing came, the southern kingdom would do something no one expected, something that looked, on the surface, like nothing more than a library project. And it would turn out to be one of the most important things God did in the entire silence. For about 100 years, the little land of Judea belonged to the south. The Ptolemies ruled from Egypt, from a brand new city on the Mediterranean coast that Alexander had founded and named after himself. Alexandria. And Alexandria became something the ancient world had never seen. A Greek city on Egyptian soil, gleaming white, with a lighthouse taller than anything built before it, and at its heart, a library. Not a room of books, a machine for collecting all the knowledge on earth. The Ptolemies wanted every scroll ever written, in every language, translated into Greek and shelved in Alexandria. And that ambition, that vain, imperial hunger to own every book, is where God quietly slipped a gift into the dark. Because among the peoples now living under Greek rule were the Jews. And not just in Judea. Over the centuries, Jewish families had scattered, some carried off in old conquests, some drawn by trade, some simply following the roads Alexander had opened. There was now a large Jewish community living right there in Alexandria. And here is the thing about children raised in a Greek city, speaking Greek in the streets, doing business in Greek, dreaming in Greek. Within a generation or two, many of them could no longer read Hebrew. Think about what that means. A Jewish boy in Alexandria could recite Greek poetry, but could not read the Torah of his own ancestors. The scriptures were becoming a locked box. The very people they were written for were losing the key. And this is where it gets remarkable. According to the old tradition, the king of Egypt wanted a copy of the Hebrew law for his great library. So scholars were brought from Jerusalem to Alexandria. The tradition says 72 of them, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, and set to work translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Into Koine, the common tongue. The finished translation came to be called the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70, and even today scholars abbreviate it with the Roman numerals for 70, a nod to those 70 translators. Now, on the surface, this looks like nothing. A library acquisition, a bureaucratic translation project ordered by a Greek king who wanted a complete set. But step back and look at what actually just happened. For the first time in history, the Word of God was no longer locked inside one language spoken by one small nation. The story of creation, the promises to Abraham, the law of Moses, the Psalms of David, the thunder of Isaiah, all of it was now sitting in the single language that the entire known world could read. A Greek in Antioch could read Genesis. A merchant in Rome could read the prophets. A God-fearing Roman soldier in some far garrison could pick up Isaiah and read, in his own common tongue, about a suffering servant who would be wounded for the sins of others. Here is why that matters so much. When the apostles later fan out across the empire preaching that Jesus is the promised Messiah, what do they preach from? They quote the scriptures constantly, hundreds of times. And more often than not, they are quoting the Septuagint. The Greek translation made in a pagan king's library becomes the missionary Bible of the early church. When Paul stands in a synagogue in Greece and says, "As it is written," the scroll he unrolls is Greek. Even many of the Old Testament quotations printed in your New Testament match the Greek Septuagint rather than the original Hebrew. God used a vain king's library to prepare the exact text the gospel would travel on. Nobody in Alexandria knew that. They thought they were filing a book, but the language was only half of it. Something else was being built in the silence, something even more important than a translation, and it was being built not out of ambition, but out of loss. Remember, the Jews were scattered now. Most of them lived nowhere near Jerusalem. They could not walk to the temple for worship. They could not offer the daily sacrifices. So what did they do? In town after town, wherever 10 Jewish men could be gathered, they began meeting together on the Sabbath to do the one thing they could still do anywhere. They read the scriptures. They prayed. They taught their children the law. They had a Greek word for the place they gathered. Synagogue. It simply means a gathering together. We say it as synagogue. There is no command in the law of Moses to build a synagogue. The synagogue was born in the silence, out of the ache of a scattered people who could not get home. But by the time the New Testament opens, there is a synagogue in nearly every town in the empire where Jews live. And that becomes the launch pad for the entire Christian mission. Read the book of Acts. Everywhere Paul goes, the first place he walks, and 2 is the synagogue. The pulpit was already built. The audience was already gathered. The scriptures were already open, and now they were in Greek. Do you see it? The language, the translation, the meeting places, a delivery system for the gospel, assembled piece by piece across centuries in total silence. But not everything in the silence was gentle. The gift was almost destroyed, because when Judea passed from the gentle south to the cruel north, a man was coming who would try to burn the whole thing down. Let me pause here for just a moment, because we are standing at a turning point in the story, and I want to make sure something has landed. Look at what God has done so far in the silence. He has spread a common language across the whole earth. He has translated his own scriptures into that language. He has scattered his people into every city and given them a place to gather and read those scriptures every single week. Not one word from a prophet in all that time. And yet every piece is falling into place quietly, precisely like a hand setting a table before the guests arrive. That is the pattern. Silence on the surface, God at work underneath. Remember it, because we are about to watch it hold true through fire and blood. If this is stirring something in you, if you are starting to see your own quiet seasons a little differently, do me a favor and subscribe so the rest of this story finds its way back to you. And I would love to know. Leave a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from. It genuinely moves me to see how far this reaches. Now take a breath, because the gentle century is over. Judea is about to fall into the hands of the north, and onto the throne in the north is about to climb a man who called himself a god and tried to prove it by desecrating the holiest place on earth. Around the year 200 before Christ, the tug of war ended. The northern kingdom, the Seleucids, wrenched Judea away from Egypt, and for a while, life went on. Then, in the year 175, a new king climbed onto the Seleucid throne, and everything changed. His name was Antiochus. He was the 4th king to carry that name, so history calls him Antiochus IV, but he gave himself a title. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, and you need to hear what that word means, because it tells you everything about the man. Epiphanes means God manifest, God made visible. He put it on his coins. He wanted every subject who bought a loaf of bread to hold in his hand a little metal claim that the king was a god walking the earth. His own people did not buy it. Behind his back, they twisted his title into a pun. Instead of Epiphanes, God manifest, they called him Epimanes, the madman. And the madman had a plan. He looked at his patchwork empire, stitched together from a dozen conquered peoples, and he decided the way to hold it together was to make everyone the same. One culture, one set of gods, one Greek way of life, top to bottom. The technical name for it was Hellenization, from the Greek word for Greek. Every people under his rule would think Greek, speak Greek, worship Greek, and most of them went along with it because most of the gods of the ancient world were interchangeable anyway. You added the Greek gods to your shelf next to your old ones, and life went on. But there was one people who could not add a god to the shelf, because their God had said from the very beginning, "You shall have no other gods before me," the Jews. At first, Antiochus tried bribery in politics. He found ambitious men inside Jerusalem itself who were happy to trade their faith for status, men who wanted Jerusalem to be a fashionable Greek city. They built a Greek gymnasium right by the temple, where young men exercised in the Greek fashion, naked, and some Jewish men were so eager to fit in that they underwent painful surgery to hide the mark of the covenant on their own bodies. The rot, at first, came from the inside, but bribery was not enough for the madman, so he turned to terror. Here is the part nobody tells you about the silence. It nearly ended in genocide. Antiochus issued a series of decrees and read them slowly, because every one of them was aimed at the heart of the faith. It became a crime, punishable by death, to keep the Sabbath. It became a crime to own a copy of the Torah. Soldiers went house to house, and where they found a scroll, they tore it up and burned it, and often burned its owner with it. It became a crime to circumcise your son. Josephus and the books of the Maccabees record what they did to the mothers who defied that last law. They were paraded, through the city, with their circumcised infants hung around their necks, and then thrown from the city wall to their deaths. That was the price of obedience. And then Antiochus went for the throat. In the year 167 before Christ, he marched into the temple in Jerusalem, the one place on earth where the God of Israel had put his name, and he defiled it on purpose with theater and cruelty. He set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus right on top of the altar of God. And on that altar, in the holy place, he sacrificed a pig. To the Jewish people, there was no animal more unclean, no act more calculated to spit in the face of everything they held sacred. He took the blood and the broth of that pig and splashed it through the sanctuary. Now go back 350 years to the prophet Daniel, writing in the silence before the silence. Daniel had written that a king would arise who would pollute the sanctuary and set up the abomination that mocketh desolate. The words are chillingly exact. Long before Antiochus was born, the defilement had been written down. This is the low point of the 400 years. The lamp in the temple was extinguished. The daily sacrifice stopped. The scriptures were burning in the streets. And to a faithful Jew standing in the wreckage of the holy place, watching pig's blood run down the steps, it must have felt like the final proof. God is not silent. God is dead. God has abandoned us, and there is no one left to hear us scream. But listen to what was happening in the middle of that horror. The book of 2nd Maccabees tells the story of an old scribe named Eleazar, 90 years old, one of the most respected teachers in the nation. They dragged him out and ordered him to eat pork in public, to break under Greek law, and set the example that would break everyone else. His friends, trying to save his life, whispered that he could just pretend, bring his own clean meat, and let the crowd think he had obeyed. Eleazar refused. At 90 years old, he said he would not stain his old age with a lie that the young men were watching, and he would rather die nobly than live in shame. And they beat him to death. Then came a mother and her 7 sons. One by one, the sons were tortured in front of her and told to eat the forbidden meat, and one by one they refused. And here is what one of them said as he died. He looked at his executioners and told them that they could take away his present life, but the King of the universe would raise him up again to an everlasting life, because he had died for God's laws. Sit with that. In the darkest hour of the silence, under the worst tyrant, a dying boy speaks out loud a hope that will echo straight into the New Testament, the hope of resurrection. That God does not lose his faithful in the grave. It is one of the first times we hear it stated so plainly in Jewish history. It was born in fire. So this is not a story about a defeated people. This is not a story about a dead God. This is not a story about the end of the faith. This is a story about a spark that a madman thought he had stamped out, and it was already catching. Because up in a little village in the hills, an old priest was about to be handed the same choice as Eleazar. And he was going to answer with a sword. The village was called Modian, a small place in the hills, a day's walk from Jerusalem. Nothing important had ever happened there. And into Modian, one day, rode the king's officers, doing what they were doing in every village across Judea. They set up a pagan altar in the town square, gathered the people, and demanded that someone come forward and offer a sacrifice to the Greek gods, publicly, to prove the village had submitted. Living in Modian was an old priest named Mattathias, with 5 grown sons. He was exactly the kind of man the king wanted to break, because he was respected, and if the respected man bowed, everyone bowed. The officers singled him out. They offered him wealth, friendship with the king, honor for his whole family. All he had to do was walk up to the altar and make one small sacrifice. Mattathias looked at that altar, and he said no. He said that even if every nation in the empire obeyed, he and his sons and his brothers would keep the covenant of their fathers. He would not abandon the law. And then something snapped. Another Jew, a frightened neighbor, stepped forward to do the sacrifice in Mattathias's place, to save the village, to make the soldiers go away. And the old priest watched one of his own people walk up to that altar to bow to a foreign god on the soil of the promised land. He could not bear it. He drew a blade. and he killed the man on the altar steps, and then he killed the king's officer standing beside it, and he tore the pagan altar down. Then the old priest turned to the stunned crowd and shouted a single sentence that lit the fuse of the whole revolt. He cried out, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and stands by the covenant follow me." And he fled into the hills with his sons, and the resistance was born. Mattathias was old, and he did not live long into the war. But before he died, he handed leadership to his son. And this son was something the ancient world would not forget. His name was Judas, and his people gave him a nickname that stuck to him like armor. They called him Maccabeus. Most scholars think it comes from the word for hammer. Judas the Hammer. The whole family and the whole revolt would carry that name down through history. The Maccabees. Now watch what happens next, because on paper it is impossible. Judas had a ragged band of farmers and shepherds and priests hiding in caves, armed with whatever they could carry. Against them stood the Seleucid Empire, one of the successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great, with professional soldiers, cavalry, and even war elephants. There was no version of this where the Maccabees should have won. And yet Judas the Hammer understood his hills the way the Greek generals never could. He struck at night. He ambushed columns in narrow passes, where the elephants and cavalry were useless. He hit and vanished and hit again. Battle after battle, an empire's army was bled by a handful of men who knew every rock. And against all military logic, Judas won. Not a skirmish, the war. He fought his way, at last, all the way back to Jerusalem, to the temple itself, the temple where the pig had been sacrificed, where the altar to Zeus still stood, where the lamp had gone dark. Imagine walking back into that, the most sacred place your people know, and it has been used as a slaughterhouse for a foreign god for 3 years. The Maccabees found the sanctuary overgrown, the gates burned, the altar defiled. And they did not curse, and they did not despair. They cleaned it. They tore down the polluted altar stone by stone and built a new one. They made new holy vessels to replace the ones that had been stolen. They scrubbed the place where their fathers had wept. And then, in December of the year 164 before Christ, exactly 3 years after the abomination, they rededicated the temple to the God of Israel. They relit the great lamp. They restored the daily sacrifice that Antiochus had stopped, and they held an 8-day festival of celebration and dedication. The Hebrew word for dedication is Hanukkah. You know it as Hanukkah. That festival, the one Jewish families still light candles for every December, was born right here, in the middle of the 400 years of silence, out of the ashes of the worst desecration in their history. It is a festival that celebrates one thing above all, that when it looked like the light of God had been snuffed out forever, it was relit. And here is the thread I promised you would matter. Turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 10. It mentions, almost in passing, that it was winter and that Jesus was walking in the temple during the Feast of Dedication. That is Hanukkah. Jesus himself, the light of the world, walks through the temple courts during the very festival that celebrates the relighting of the lamp. The New Testament does not just come after the Maccabees. It reaches back and touches them. The silence and the Gospels are woven from the same thread. So the spark that Antiochus tried to stamp out did not die. It caught. It burned an empire's army out of the promised land and relit the lamp in the house of God. And for a moment, for one shining moment, the Jewish people were free, ruling themselves for the first time in centuries, with the temple pure and the law restored. It should have been the happy ending, but you already know it is not, because you know your history. You know that, when the New Testament opens, Judea is not free. Judea is crushed under the boot of Rome, and a paranoid puppet king sits on the throne. So what happened? How does a people who threw off an empire end up, within 100 years, in chains again? The answer is one of the oldest and saddest patterns in the human heart. And we have to watch it happen. Here is the oldest and saddest pattern in the human heart. It is easier to survive an enemy than to survive a victory. The family of the Maccabees had won, and with the winning came power. Judas the Hammer eventually fell in battle, but his brothers carried on, and the dynasty they founded is called the Hasmonean dynasty, after an ancestral name in the family. For about 80 years, this family ruled a free and independent Judea, and slowly, quietly, they became the very thing they had fought against. It started with the priesthood. Remember, this was a family of priests. But under the law of Moses, the high priest was supposed to come from one specific line, the descendants of Aaron, and the priest was never, ever supposed to be the king. Israel's whole system kept those two chairs separate. The priest served in the temple. The king sat on the throne. No man held both. The Hasmoneans took both chairs. They made themselves high priest and king at the same time. The men who had gone to war precisely because a tyrant trampled God's law now bent that same law to crown themselves. And once a family decides the rules do not apply to them, the rot spreads fast. Stay with me, because this is where the political map of the New Testament is actually drawn. As the Hasmoneans grew more worldly, more Greek in their tastes, more hungry for power, the faithful began to split into groups over a single burning question: how do you stay pure in a compromised world? Different answers hardened into different parties. And these are not dusty names. These are the exact groups Jesus will argue with on every page of the Gospels. One group said the answer was rigorous separation. Guard the law, build a fence around it, keep every rule, and add more rules to protect the rules, and stay clean by staying apart. Their very name comes from a word meaning the separated ones. We call them the Pharisees. They were, at their best, deeply serious about God, and they will be the group Jesus both rebukes most sharply and, in some ways, sounds most like. Another group came from the wealthy, aristocratic, priestly families, the ones running the temple, the ones comfortable, with power and cozy, with whoever was in charge. They rejected a lot of the newer beliefs. They did not, for instance, believe in the resurrection of the dead, that hope the 7 brothers had died for. We call them the Sadducees. When you read in the Gospels that the Pharisees and Sadducees, who agreed on almost nothing, kept teaming up against Jesus, now you know where they came from and why they were already at each other's throats. But there were others, and 2 of them you have to meet, because they are hiding in plain sight in the New Testament. Some looked at the corruption in Jerusalem, the priest kings, the compromise, the whole polluted mess, and decided the only way to stay pure was to leave. They walked out into the desert, down by the Dead Sea, and built a strict community in the wilderness to wait for God to purify everything by force. We call them the Essenes, and here's why that matters. In caves near their settlement, hidden in clay jars, they left their library behind. Nearly 2,000 years later, a shepherd boy throwing a rock into a cave would hear pottery shatter, and the world would recover the Dead Sea Scrolls, copies of the Hebrew Scriptures 1,000 years older than any we had before, proving how carefully the word had been kept through the silence. That library was buried during these years. It was waiting the whole time. And then there were the ones who gave up on waiting altogether. They looked at the Roman boot on Judea's neck and decided the answer was a sword, that God helps those who fight. In time they would harden into the group history calls the Zealots. Hold on to that name, because when Jesus chooses his 12, one of them is called Simon the Zealot. The Messiah picks a man who wanted to overthrow Rome by force and teaches him a different kind of kingdom entirely. Stop and take this in. The Pharisees, Jesus debates. The Sadducees who deny the resurrection. The Essenes out in the desert. The Zealot he calls to follow him. Every single group Jesus will meet was born right here in the silence. By the time he steps onto the stage, the whole cast is already waiting for him. So the free Jewish state, born in such glory, was curdling from the inside. Corrupt priest kings on the throne, the people fracturing into rival camps. And then came the thing that always comes when a house divides against itself. Civil war. Late in the dynasty, 2 Hasmonean brothers went to war over who would be king and high priest. Brother against brother, each with his own army, each willing to burn the country down to sit in the chair. And in their desperation, each brother did the most fateful thing anyone in this whole story does. They both looked west to the new power rising on the horizon, the power that was swallowing the Mediterranean whole. They both sent envoys to Rome, and each one begged Rome to intervene on his side. You can almost hear heaven sigh. They invited the wolf into the house to settle an argument between two sheep. Rome was delighted to come. In the year 63 before Christ, the Roman general Pompey marched on Jerusalem to settle the dispute, which of course meant to take the country. And Pompey did something that seared itself into the Jewish memory. After his soldiers broke the resistance, Pompey walked into the temple. Not just the courts. He pushed all the way in, past every barrier, into the Holy of Holies itself, the innermost room, the one place on earth where only the high priest could go, and only once a year, and only with blood and trembling. Pompey, a pagan Roman, strolled in out of simple curiosity to see what the Jews kept in there. And the strangest thing happened. The Roman historians tell us Pompey found the room empty. No idol, no golden statue, no image of any kind. Just empty space and holy silence. Rome had conquered a people whose God could not be seen and could not be captured, and the general did not know what to make of it. He shrugged, left the temple treasury untouched, and walked out. But the damage was done. The Holy of Holies had been violated by a Gentile, and Judea was now, and would remain, a possession of Rome. Feel the full weight of it. The people who had thrown off the Greek Empire with a hammer and a prayer had, within 100 years, handed themselves to a far greater empire, not because Rome was too strong to resist, but because they could not stop fighting each other. The freedom the Maccabees bled for was gone, and it was gone by their own hand. To a faithful Jew alive in that generation, the silence must have felt total and final. For 100 years, almost, no prophet, foreign boots in the holy city again, corrupt priests, a pagan eagle flying over Jerusalem. If God was ever going to speak, if he was ever going to send the deliverer the prophets had promised, surely now was the time. And still, nothing, just the tramp of Roman sandals and the ache of an unanswered prayer. But that ache was not a sign that God had failed. That ache was the point, because a people who are comfortable do not cry out for a savior. A people who are crushed, disappointed, out of options, tired of false kings and failed revolts. That is a people ready to recognize the real king when he finally comes. The cup was almost full. There was just one man left to put on the stage. A monster of a man, brilliant and bloody. And it is on his watch, in the darkest, most Roman, most hopeless hour of the whole 400 years, that the silence finally breaks. His name was Herod, and history calls him Herod the Great. He earned the title, and he did not deserve it. Rome needed a strong man to run Judea for them, someone ruthless enough to keep the fractious Jews in line, and loyal enough to keep sending Rome its taxes. They found Herod. He was not even fully Jewish. He came from Idumea, the old land of Edom, a people forced into the Jewish faith generations earlier, which meant the Jews never accepted him as truly one of their own. He knew it, and it made him dangerous, because Herod was brilliant and Herod was terrified. He was one of the great builders of the ancient world. He raised entire cities out of nothing. He built a harbor at Caesarea using an engineering trick with underwater concrete that historians only fully understood in modern times. And most astonishing of all, to win over the people who hated him, he tore down the modest Second Temple and rebuilt it into one of the wonders of the age, gleaming white stone and gold that travelers said blazed like a mountain of snow and fire in the sun. That is the temple Jesus will teach in. Herod built it, but the same man who built the temple could not stop killing. He was so afraid of losing his throne that he murdered anyone he suspected, including his own family. He executed his favorite wife. He executed 3 of his own sons. The Roman Emperor Augustus is said to have joked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son, because at least Herod, keeping up Jewish appearances, would not eat the pig. And this is the man on the throne when the wise men arrive from the east asking, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" You understand now exactly why Herod reacted the way he did. A paranoid usurper, hated by his people, terrified of any rival, and travelers show up announcing a rival king has been born. Of course, he ordered the infants of Bethlehem killed. It is the most Herod thing Herod ever did. The slaughter of the innocents is not a random horror. It is the perfectly logical act of the exact monster the 400 years had placed on the throne. Now stop and look at the whole board, because everything is finally in place. Look at the language. Alexander spilled Koine Greek across the whole world, and it is still the common tongue. A gospel preached in Greek can be understood from Britain to Babylon. Look at the scriptures. They have already been translated into that Greek, sitting ready in the Septuagint, so that any Gentile anywhere can read the promise of a Messiah. Look at the meeting places. There is a synagogue in nearly every city, full of people who gather every Sabbath around the open scriptures, a ready-made pulpit in every town the apostles will ever visit. Look at the roads. Rome, the empire everyone hated, has done one useful thing. It has paved the world. Roman roads run straight and safe from one end of the empire to the other, patrolled by Roman soldiers, connecting every city. Rome even calls the peace it enforces the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. A missionary can now walk from Jerusalem to Rome on paved roads in a single language in relative safety. It has never been possible before. It will be the golden age of travel for centuries. And look, most of all, at the hearts. 400 years of foreign boots and false kings and failed revolts and unanswered prayers have done something to the soul of a nation. They are aching. They are watching. All across Judea, faithful people are scanning the horizon, whispering the old promises, waiting for the anointed one, the Messiah, to come and set it all right. The hunger is at its peak. The ground has never been more ready for a seed. Now hear the sentence Paul wrote, and hear it with new ears. When the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, the fullness of time, not a random Tuesday. The one moment in all of history when the language, the scriptures, the synagogues, the roads, and the aching, ready hearts had all come together at once. God had not been absent for 400 years. He had been setting a table, and the instant the last fork was laid down, he sat his Son at the head of it. Let me hold this thought right here for a moment, because if you have felt any of this, I want to ask something of you. If this story has shown you your Bible in a way you had not seen before, share this video with one person who needs to hear that God is not silent in their silence. That is how a story like this travels, the same way the gospel did, one person handing it to the next. Now, back to the table God set. Because I promised you an old man. It is time. Go back, all the way back, to the very beginning of this story, to the image I planted and asked you to hold. An old man, climbing the temple steps, holding something in his arms. His name is Simeon. Luke tells us he was a righteous and devout man in Jerusalem, and that he was waiting for the consolation of Israel. Waiting. That word is the whole 400 years compressed into a single old man. Luke says the Holy Spirit had revealed to Simeon that he would not die until he had seen the Messiah with his own eyes. So he waited, day after day, in a nation under Roman occupation, ruled by a murderous Herod, in a temple that would soon fall. This old man kept coming, kept watching, kept believing that the God, who had said nothing for centuries, would keep his word. And one ordinary day, a poor young couple from Nazareth climbs those same temple steps to present their firstborn son, as the law required, with the cheapest offering the law allowed, 2 young birds, the offering of people who could not afford a lamb. Nothing about them draws a single eye, and the Spirit moves in Simeon, and the old man crosses the courts, and he does the thing he has waited his entire life to do. He takes the baby into his arms. 400 years of silence, 400 years of empires, and martyrs and hammers, and traitors and unanswered prayer. 400 years of a nation crying into what felt like an empty sky, and it all comes down to this. An old man's waiting hands, finally full, and Simeon looks down into the face of a working family's infant, and he knows. And he says the words that end the silence forever. Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation. Now I can die, Because I have seen him. That is how the silence breaks. Not with thunder on a mountain. Not with an army in the sky. It breaks in the trembling arms of an old man holding a poor couple's baby in an occupied city, under a tyrant, in a temple built by a murderer. God's biggest promise, delivered in the quietest possible way. And do you remember the very last thing Malachi said before the silence fell? The unfinished promise, the door left open a crack. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet. For 400 years, that promise hung in the air, unresolved. And when the silence finally breaks, out of the wilderness comes a wild man in camel's hair, eating locusts, preaching repentance, preparing the way. And Jesus says of him plainly, if you are willing to receive it, this is the Elijah who was to come. The last word of the Old Testament and the first act of the New reach across 4 centuries and clasp hands. The promise was never forgotten. It was only waiting for its hour. The messenger came, the silence ended, and the God, who had seemed to say nothing for 400 years had, in fact, been speaking the whole time, in every road, every scroll, every synagogue, every ache. You just had to know how to listen. So what do we do with 400 years of silence? Let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of this. The first is simple, and it is a fact. The silence was never empty. Between Malachi and Matthew, God was not gone. He was working, spreading a language, translating his word, scattering his people, building their meeting places, paving the roads, and aching the hearts of a whole nation until they were ready. Every piece the gospel would need was set in place during the years it looked like nothing was happening. When you read that blank page in your Bible now, you will never see it as blank again. It was the busiest page in the book. The second is closer to home. If God worked like that across 400 years of history, then he is capable of working exactly like that across the silent seasons of your life. And you have had them. The prayer that seemed to hit the ceiling, the waiting room, the phone that would not ring with the news you were begging for, the stretch of months or years when heaven felt like a locked door and you wondered if anyone was on the other side. I want you to hear this. The people living through the 400 years thought God had forgotten them, and they were standing in the middle of his greatest work of preparation. His silence was not his absence. It was his setting of the table, and there is no reason to believe he treats you differently than he treated them. Which brings me to the last thing, and this is the one I most want you to feel. The same God who filled an old man's waiting arms is the God who holds yours. Simeon waited his whole life in an occupied city under a tyrant for a promise that had gone quiet for 4 centuries. And God kept it, not one day early, not one day late, but in the fullness of time, right down to the trembling of an old man's hands. If he was faithful across 400 years of history, through empires and martyrs and traitors and Roman chains, then he is faithful across the far shorter silence you are living in right now. The God who was never silent then is not silent now. He is setting your table too. And when the fullness of your time comes, you will look back at the quiet years and understand what he was building the whole time. So let me ask you something, and I really do want your answer. Which part of these 400 years hit you the hardest? Was it the old scribe who chose death over a lie? The hammer relighting the lamp? Pompey standing baffled in an empty room? Or Simeon finally holding what he had waited a lifetime to see? Tell me in the comments below. I read them, and I learn from you. And if this helped you see God's hand in the silence, do 2 things before you go. Subscribe so the next story finds you. And send this to someone you know who is sitting in a quiet season right now, wondering if God has forgotten them. Because here is the truth the 400 years were built to teach us. The silence of God is never the absence of God. Sometimes the quiet is not him leaving. Sometimes the quiet is him getting everything ready.